Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom, AP Euro Edition. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic, the end of the Cold War and the nationalism that brought an end to it, along with what happens next in Europe. Now, before we begin, as always, click pause on your screen, jot down the lecture outline, and also take particular attention to those key terms. Make sure you can address the who, what, where, when, and why, as well as be able to connect the terms together. Now with that, let's begin. Now, most of the last lecture was all about the causes of the Cold War, the beginnings of the Cold War, and how it really became entrenched throughout not just Europe, but the world. Today's topic is the end of the Cold War and what happens next. In both cases, though, there is a corresponding interwoven fabric that is the idea of nationalism. That's going to help both bring about the end of the Cold War as well as cause decolonization through the rest of the world. Now, if you're taking particular close lecture notes, we will do points 1, 2, and 3. We will pause and then come back for part 2 of this lecture, which will be on nationalism since 1945. Now, so let's begin here. Now, by the end of the 1970s, many things had happened. If you remember our last lecture, we kind of ended with the Soviet Union had decided to invade Afghanistan, both to expand and for resources. Now, if you know your history at all, you know this is going to be a very costly, detrimental endeavor that will ultimately lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. But it has ripple effects throughout the world. We discussed some of them last time. Let's pick up right there. Now, in the wake of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, NATO wasn't particularly gung-ho about this, but on the other hand, a smaller subunit of NATO known as the Atlantic Alliance. And it revitalizes itself in the early 1980s. And again, in direct response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And this Atlantic Alliance consists in being led by the new U.S. President, 1980, Ronald Reagan, took office in 1981, with the Margaret Thatcher, Prime Minister of the UK, and Helmut Kohl of Germany. Now, all three of these nations, Great Britain, the United States, and the United Kingdom, believed that the Soviet Union remained an extremely dangerous threat, even as much of the rest of the world was beginning to think that the Soviet Union was fizzling out. And again, on the heels of the 1979 Afghan invasion, there was some strong reason to believe that the Soviets still pose a major threat. And so in 1979, Margaret Thatcher becomes prime minister. She came to power a year after bitter strikes had eroded all support for the current Socialist Labour Party that had been ruling in the UK. And as a conservative, she advocated hardline military positions. Now, please take note, this was a wave of conservatism that we saw in the late 70s, early 1980s. And if you know your US history from last year very well, you'll remember we spent a long time detailing how 1980 was a turning point politically in the United States. It saw the entrenchment of conservatism. Likewise, in the UK with Margaret Thatcher, conservatism was on the rise throughout the world. And of course, we've seen a recent trend again in 2016 with a new rise across the world with conservative regimes in power. Now, let's go back to the topic in 1980 now. So in 1979, she comes to power, and she will maintain a strong anti-Cold War presence. For example, in the Falklands War of 1982, when the Argentinian forces invaded and occupied the Falkland Islands, some 500 miles off the coast of Argentina, Thatcher will send a fleet to retake the islands, which provides and grants her enormous popularity, and grants her re-election as a result. In the United States, it is a hardline stance of Ronald Reagan against the Soviets that will help propel him to great popularity in the United States and throughout the world. He dealt with the Soviets from a position of power. And it's these three men, right? So Thatcher, Reagan, Kohl, in Reagan especially, he deals with the Soviets directly from a position of power. Détente from Nixon was out. Instead, Reagan's hard line was in. And one of the reasons he's able to do so is because Reagan believed the US could bear the burden of the expense, whereas the Russians could not. Remember, the Russians went to Afghanistan for resources. Now, in the 70s, there was a global economic crisis caused by the energy crisis. And the United States was not impervious to that. But part of the reason the Soviets go into Afghanistan is to get access to those crude oil reserves. They failed miserably at that. The Afghans are able to push them back. But in the United States, under Reagan, the United States is able to recover, and he may very well have been correct. The U.S. was able to bear the financial burdens of an endeavor against the Soviets. And so he begins to initiate a program known as SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, that he dubbed, quote unquote, Star Wars, again, former actor. And the idea was to pursue high technology missile defense system that would essentially involve lasers shooting the missiles out of the air. If it sounds too good to be true, it's because it is. It's not realistic. But at the time, people weren't sure if it was realistic or not. And as a result, the Soviets will spend a buttload of money they don't have trying to keep up with the theoretical progress Reagan is making. And while Reagan's dramatic expansion of the defense fund will actually help lead the United States out of stagflation in the 1970s, in the Soviet Union is going to help lead to financial ruin and bankruptcy. And of course, this only intensifies when the Soviets shoot down a Korean passenger airliner that had accidentally flown over Soviet airspace, to which Reagan dubs the Soviet Union the quote-unquote evil empire. Well, everything begins to change, though. Again, this ramps up the Cold War for a short period of time in the first half of the 1980s. But by the second half, we're going to start seeing the final death blow, the final cooling of the Cold War. And it takes largely place in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev takes power in the Soviet Union and begins to institute two major reform initiatives. Now, first of all, Gorbachev was a much younger ruler. He was in his early 50s and considerably younger than most of the communist hardliners that had preceded him. It was not that he did not believe in communism, but it was that he realized that the brand of communism that was being, performed in the Soviet Union was failing miserably. So he instituted two major program reforms, the first one being perestroika. You see the spelling on the left of your screen. Perestroika translates restructuring. And this idea is aimed to revive the sagging Soviet economy by adapting many of the free market practices of the West. Wait, did I just say that? Communist Soviet Union wanted to adapt many of the free market practices of the West, realizing that maybe there was a halfway point between communism and democracy or socialism. Unfortunately, by 1987, within 2 years, the program is a large failure. It does not revive the economy. His second reform initiative, though known as Glasnost, you see the spelling on the right of your screen. Glasnost is far more successful. And this is aimed at opening Soviet society, Soviet culture, by introducing free speech. Some political liberties. In other words, the Communist Party is not the only party, maybe. And it did end a lot of party censorship. Now, I'm not trying to say they became completely free speech here, but they did ease some of the restrictions where it was now allowed to criticize the government to a certain extent. And the result of this, 1989, Soviet Union will offer the first free elections since 1917. Think about that for a minute. 1989 is the first real free election. Now, I'm not saying it was perfect. I'm not saying it was free of, conspiracy or anything that was maybe detrimental or ballot stuffing. But there were free elections in the Soviet Union for the first time since 1917. And as a result of this, Gorbachev is trying to reduce those East-West tensions. Remember, he's trying to bring in some Western influence into his country. And as a result, there is an easing of the Cold War. Even the hardline Ronald Reagan understands this and begins to adapt and adopt a much more soft stance. And so what does he do? Well, he withdraws troops from Afghanistan. It's a good first step that helps show the world he means what he says. Second, in 1987, December of 1987, Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan will sign the INF Treaty. And this is an intermediate range nuclear missiles from Europe are banned. Now, this is considered a major milestone in the reduction of Cold War tensions. Which, fun aside, it was just, by the way, the United States just pulled out of the INF Treaty just last January when Donald Trump said that the United States should because, well, according to him, now Russia has been violating the INF Treaty for years, and therefore the U.S. should not abide by it either. But this event in 1987 was considered a major turning point. It's a tremendous easing of the Cold War tensions. And history will tell us whether or not Donald Trump is right and whether or not we should have pulled out or not. But nonetheless, the result of this, though, again, think of this for a minute. For the first time since 1917, there's free elections in the Soviet Union, in Russia proper. He signaled the reduction of tensions with the INF Treaty. He has offered free speech. He's offered less censorship of the press. And those Eastern European nations that were dominated by the Soviet Union ever since World War II, they begin to respond. And they respond in what's known as the revolutions of 1989. Now, I know this is AP Euro. We've had a number of, hey, revolutions of 1848, revolutions of 1830. Well, another round of revolutions in Europe. This is the revolutions of 1989. And this is the one that's going to break up the Soviet Union. And I have them listed on your screen for you. There are 7 major ones. There are more than that, but there are 7 major ones that I'm going to quickly go over. And these represent 7 major revolutions in 1989, 1990 that will see those Eastern Bloc nations that have been dominated by communism ever since 1945 the chance for independence. And we're going to start with Poland. Poland, for the first time, were able to have free elections in June 1989. In fact, in June 1989, not only will they have free elections, they will elect the first non-communist leader in Eastern Europe since the Stalin era. And this was kind of a test run for all those Eastern Bloc nations. Because once Poland was successful, it opened the floodgates of revolution across Eastern Europe. So second on the list was Hungary. In October 23rd, 1989, Hungarian leaders proclaim an independent republic. In the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down in November, and East German government fell as a result. And then early 1990, they begin the reunification process, and by July of 1990, East and West German economies are reunited and merged together. Now, theoretically, the Soviets did oppose a unified Germany because NATO would essentially pull them in. The thing is NATO wanted to absorb the new unified Germany into NATO, which is something that the Soviet Union did not want to see in losing East Germany. However, the Soviet Union eventually acquiesced, only because West Germany bailed out and provided a tremendous economic aid package to the Soviet Union. So again, they're finally getting the opportunity to take that aid from the West. And then December 1989, Czechoslovakia. The fall of the Berlin Wall inspired reformers to break away from Soviet influence. And In December of 1989, a dissident playwright became the president of Czechoslovakia. Just 4 years later, 1993, the Czech Republic and Slovakia will split into two different countries. Why? Because they realized that as one nation, they were going to be on the road to a civil war due to ethnic differences and due to nationalist differences. Each ethnic group wanted to have their own branch of or own nationalist government, and due to the nationalism behind each of these countries, this became the impetus to leave the Soviet Union and elect new leaders. November 1989 also saw Bulgaria. Again, the Berlin Wall collapses and Bulgarians demand that their leader resign. They purged Stalinists from their country and encouraged ethnic Turks to return. Again, trying to restore the old nationalist pride of Bulgaria. In Romania, the oppressive dictator was overthrown and assassinated in December 1989. Albania, Europe's poorest country in early 1990. Again, inspired by the overthrow, in this case, the overthrow in Romania. Demonstrations will plague the government for more than a year, and finally, in June 1991, the communist government will fall there as well. Again, these are 7 different Eastern Bloc nations that, because of Gorbachev easing those tensions, because of him allowing free elections in Russia proper, now have the opportunity to become their own nations. They pushed their own nationalist message, they overthrew the communist regimes and installed who they wanted. Now, you can argue that there were some problems going forward in all these countries. There probably is. But this time, they have their own self-determination. This becomes the big trend, self-determination. Using the nationalism in your country to self-determine where you want to go. Now, the result of this, though, also helps show just how far the USSR has collapsed. And so let's switch gears here a minute and talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, long-term causes. First of all, one of the biggest long-term causes is the cost of protecting and maintaining an empire in Eastern Europe. Most of those Eastern European nations were quite poor. And the cost of not only propping them up, providing aid to them, but also protecting them from from rebellions that would seek to overthrow a communist government was very costly to the Soviet Union. Number 2, there was calls for reform from the burgeoning middle class that were strongly increasing in the 70s and 80s. So the middle class is pushing for reform, like we saw back in the 1800s in Europe. Number 3, the general economic crisis that afflicted Europe, and of course the United States as well, during the 70s, in oil crisis, energy crisis, leads to the foundation of the collapse. And again, it's one of the reasons they went to Afghanistan. So number 4, this 9-year war in Afghanistan proved detrimental because it was deadly to the loss of life. It was deadly to the economy. Again, they went there to get resources to expand. Again, given because of the energy crisis of the 70s. When they failed miserably and get bogged down in Afghanistan, it is a severe, dearth to their economy and to their morale. And then finally, number 5, nationalist resentment of the Soviet government. Again, not only from without, as far as the Western nations, but also from within, those Eastern European nations, Eastern Bloc nations, as well as those inside Russia proper, who have this nationalist vision. They don't like what's happening with the current government. Now, short-term causes. Specifically, in 1991, there was a coup in Moscow. In 1991, communist hardliners, frustrated by the loss of the Soviet Union, Soviet power. Again, those Eastern European nations are all, leaving. This is a tremendous blow to their ego. And these revolutions of 1989 produce a severe blow to these old communist hardliners, to their pride. And they see that the loss of Soviet power, they want to attempt to overthrow Gorbachev in a coup. Now, it'll fail because the military fails to support it. But in either case, Gorbachev is out, and in his place, there's a new leader, Boris Yeltsin, who becomes president of Russia from 1991 through 2000. Because basically, the coup weakens Gorbachev to the point that he realizes he needs to step down. He will. But in December 25th, 1991, Yeltsin has now declared Russia independent, and Russia itself is going to withdraw from the Soviet Union. Think about that for a minute. The new leader, Boris Yeltsin, is going to declare Russia a separation from the Soviet Union, and as a result, all the other remaining Soviet nations will also leave the Soviet Union and dissolve the USSR. In its place, you see the picture on your screen, on December 25th, 1991, Christmas Day, very unceremoniously, the red Soviet flag will be lowered over the Kremlin and the Russian flag will be raised, signaling a new era in the world. And of course, following this, the Soviet Union will be dissolved into 15 separate republics. And they will remain connected for a few years economically, known as the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. Again, to help the transition economically speaking. And if anyone remembers their history, though many of you are not old enough to remember it, none of you are old enough to remember it, 1992 Olympic Games, which featured, of course, the Dream Team for NBA basketball players. I remember that Olympics very well, and there was the Unified Squad, was the new Russian group because the Soviet Union had collapsed just December of 91. And so Summer Games of 92 in Barcelona, there was a unified squad that represented the old Russian Soviet Union squad. Who did quite well in the games that year. Now, post 1991, things were not exactly great in Central and Eastern Europe, especially for Russia. Under Boris Yeltsin, yes, they became independent, but transitioning to a market economy from a communist economy was not very quick, it was painful, and it was slow. Now, as you see on your screen, Boris Yeltsin instituted what he called shock therapy, which had been advocated by the United States and the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But it was not fully carried out by Yeltsin, and Russia failed to make the transition to a market economy, especially compared to places like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Russia fails in this regard, and instead, the money rests still in the hands of a few wealthy oligarchs. To give you some numbers on this, in 1998, the financial crisis resulted in the near collapse of the Russian banking system. Russia began to default to its foreign creditors. Their GDP dropped 15% during the 90s. Unemployment rose up to 13%. And hyperinflation was reduced, but had increased some 86% by the end of the decade. So economically speaking, shock therapy does not work very effectively, which poses some new challenge for Russian citizens and for Russian politics. Remember, they've lived under communism now for the better part of half a century. And the citizens are experiencing a crisis of identity. They try to quickly overhaul all their political procedures, all their rights and institutions, but have very limited success. Remember, people are not used to this, and there are many hardliners still in the government that did not want this. The national government struggled with distribution of scarce resources. Remember, they can't steal from their neighbors anymore. They don't have the resources. And Yeltsin was fighting one more thing, a very conservative parliament in Russia. No, that's a key term again, conservative. This conservative movement in Russia will help block the advancement of Russia under Yeltsin's shock therapy. And as a result of that, on New Year's Day 2000, Yeltsin will resign due to poor health and lack of popularity. And in his wake, we will have a new president, Vladimir Putin, who, as you should know, was just reelected recently. And assuming he lives to serve out this last term, which he's not necessarily in poor health, he is now the longest serving leader of the Russia-Soviet Union since Joseph Stalin. He takes over in 2000. He immediately begins to slowly re-centralize power by increasing the authority of the already strong executive branch of government and weakening those regional governments. So under Yeltsin, he sought to disperse power throughout different regions of Russia, but under Putin, he seeks to re-centralize government again and put all the power in his hands. Well, what happens though? He also restricts freedoms. He begins to censor the press, limit free speech again. And as a result, his economic reforms are at least somewhat successful. GDP grows between 5 and 10% a year. Unemployment decreased from 13 down to 8%. And again, not saying he's the great guy, does some terrible things, but for the economic purposes, he does help stabilize the economy. And in 2004, he'll be reelected by winning 71.3% of the vote. Now, theoretically, there was a term limit in Russia. And so in 2008, he had served out his 2 terms. So he ran for prime minister and will keep on serving with that. And many contended he remained the most powerful leader in Russia, despite the fact that Dmitry Medvedev was technically the president, but everyone knows it was Putin pulling the strings, even after Medvedev became president in 2008. And in 2012, he'll rerun for president again and win. And again, he is still the current leader in Russia. But as the economy began to stabilize itself in the early 2000s, Putin himself began to distance himself from the West once again. He wanted to create a more static, stronger, independent Russia. He will grow concerned with Eastern Bloc nations who joined NATO. He will oppose the U.S. development of a arms reduction treaty. He will oppose the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. And in general, he seems to be quite hostile to the European Union, more generally speaking. And this is largely because NATO begins to welcome in those Eastern European nations, the former Soviet nations. For example, in 1999, NATO allows in the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. In 2004, NATO allows in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria. All of this puts more pressure and isolation on Putin. And then in 2004, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Poland, Slovakia all joined the European Union. Again, once again, further isolating Russia and Putin. Now, this is where we end off when it comes to Russian history. At this current day, they are still considered a possibly dangerous nation, possibly hostile nation, who is largely isolated from the rest of the world, ruled under Putin, who, for all practical purposes, is a dictator in his country. Now, when we come back for part 2 of this lecture, we'll discuss the decolonization of the rest of the world from European imperial powers post-World War II. But until next time, take care. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.